concern for kids, which got out of control.
Wortham's assault on comics began in early 1948, and the anti-comic mood spread around the world.
Comic books were seen overseas as this virus of American culture and crime. Since they couldn't keep up with us militarily or economically anymore, they could at least try to fight against our culture.
In his 1954 book, Seduction of the Innocent, Wortham even attacked the Man of Steel, coining the term the Superman complex. Wortham defined the condition as fantasies of sadistic joy in seeing other people punished over and over again, while you yourself remain immune. Batman and Robin were like a wish dream of two homosexuals living together. Wonder Woman was the exact opposite of what girls are supposed to be.
He had the title Doctor in front of his name, and people listened to him. He was a good huckster, got a lot of publicity, and it almost destroyed the comic book business. And a lot of people were saying, good riddance, if that happened.
In 1954, U.S. Senators Estes Kefauver and Robert Hendrickson held hearings on the effects of popular culture on young minds.
They were kind of like a B-movie precursor to the Army McCarthy hearings, which were occurring at right about the same time. And they were both about equally ridiculous.
When the Senate committee's attention turned to the evils of comics, Dr. Wortham was the star witness, with testimony like, "Comic books are obscene glorifications of violence and crime. Today's children have been seduced by Superman. And Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry."
Every American saw us in this horrifically negative light. And then as an industry, we just bent over for the government.
Fearing government censorship, most of the major comic book publishers created the Comics Code Authority, a self-censoring organization that would issue seals of approval.
Everything that was published had to be sent first to this organization, and they had to put the seal of approval on it, indicating that the stories weren't too sexy, weren't too violent, and would in no way upset any young or older reader.
In their new code-approved stories, Superman worked closer than ever with lawful authorities. Batman and Robin spent more time with girls, and Wonder Woman hung out more with Steve. But superhero relationships stayed at the level of grade school crushes.
It instilled that belief in the American public that comics are strictly a kid's medium. I mean, we're still fighting against that stigma today.
The code also enforced rigid rules of conformity. About authority, it said, policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. About parents, it said, respect for parents, the moral code, and for honorable behavior shall be fostered. About ghoulish activity, it said, scenes dealing with Walking Dead, vampires, and werewolfism are prohibited. Many comic book publishers closed down. Many writers, artists, and werewolves fled the industry.
No respectable person wanted to be involved in that field. There are many stories of the comic book artists ending up in the alleys and basements of churches and ending up alcoholic.
And they did this right at the time when rock and roll was starting to break. That rebellious side of youth culture was becoming more pronounced in other media, and the comic book industry gave up that edge. They lost it, and in some ways they never quite recovered from that.
Between 1954 and 1956, comic book sales fell more than 50%. The industry would never again have the number of readers it had just before Dr. Wortham and the Senate hearings. The Comics Code placated enough of the public to save the industry. But what about the superheroes? Would they survive?
They were a dirty little secret that you read under the covers of your bed. They were the kind of thing that if your parents caught you reading them, you might get in trouble.
In 1961, the Eisenhower era was over. The new frontier was beginning. We were going to the moon. We were already in Vietnam. The comic books were still trying to recover from the impact of a government crackdown on the industry. Except for Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, most of DC's superheroes had been canceled by 1951. By the mid-50s, there were millions of kids who were unfamiliar with comic books.
By the late 50s, television was the medium of choice now for kids. The Comics Code had basically killed all the horror and crime comics, so they lost that edgy quality. So comic books went back to what had been their strength in the beginning, which was the superhero.
In 1956, editor Julius Schwartz oversaw the creation of The Flash, a sleek modern version of the fastest hero of the 40s. DC had found new success with science fiction updates of old characters: Green Lantern, Hawkman, and the Atom. Meanwhile, on a golf course in New York, comic book history was about to change forever.
My publisher, Martin Goodman, played golf with the publisher of DC Comics.
At least the legend is the publisher of DC Comics said, you know, we've actually had some luck with these superheroes.
When the new and old heroes joined forces as the Justice League of America, the series provided DC with a new successful title. While DC was on a roll, this was not the case at Martin Goodman's company, where writers and artists were churning out little morality tales featuring giant monsters, and they were tired of it.
I would make up a name like Gru or Mungor or anything that was a sound, and Jack would make a story out of it any way he wanted, and I'd put in the insipid copy.
Then Martin Goodman came back from his golf game with tales of the Justice League sales.
Stan, I want you to make up a group of heroes, because I think that's what's selling today.
Stan asked his wife Joan for advice.
She said, well, why don't you just once do a book the way you would like to do it instead of the way they want you to do it?
She's like, well, you're going to quit anyway. Just do it.
Stan Lee took the problem to his sometime collaborator, Jack Kirby, and they came up with the Fantastic Four.
Inspired by the space race between America and Russia, 4 people who don't always get along try to beat the commies to the moon. Their rocket is bombarded by cosmic rays. The quartet crash land, and they've acquired superpowers. They team up, but they still don't always get along.
Mr. Fantastic would over-explain everything, the way I tend to do. The Thing would say, will you shut up, we got it already, and he and the Torch were always arguing and fighting.
The Thing hated being the Thing, and the idea of superheroes hating being a superhero was really a novelty, and it produced a lot of psychological richness, at least comparatively speaking, that had not been seen in comic books before. And so it was with the creation of the Fantastic Four that comic books really entered into the modern era.
Lee convinced Goodman to rename his company Marvel, after Goodman's very first comic book, which had featured the original Human Torch and the Submariner. Lee and Kirby had already created a new Human Torch, and in early 1962, they revived the Submariner. Lee gave Prince Namor a more noble speaking style and a new reason to hate mankind. He blamed atomic tests for wiping out his undersea capital. Also in 1962, Lee and Kirby unleashed another atomic-aged anti-hero, the Incredible Hulk.
Of course, in those days, there were so many movies with nuclear blasts creating monsters and giant things and so forth. So I said there was a gamma ray explosion, and he got caught in it, and it transformed him.
The Hulk was a metaphor for the early 60s fear that atomic weapons would get out of hand. While saving a teenager who's trespassed onto a gamma bomb test site, the bomb's inventor, Dr. Bruce Banner, becomes a victim of his own device.
It was Banner's dark side, just sort of, metamorphosizing into flesh and blood. Green flesh and blood, of course, but there it was.
Whenever Dr. Banner changed, the army he worked for tried to kill him.
Even while the Vietnam War was going on, the Hulk's most persistent adversary was the U.S. Army. The Comics Code said that, you couldn't show the Army as villains. And yet at the same time, Marvel was basically making them to be the bad guys. They're able to do this simply by saying the Army is trying to do what it thinks is best. It just happens to be a little misinformed in this case.
The Hulk looked like a menace. He looked like a monster.
There's nobody else who understood him except the teenager whose life he saved, Rick Jones. The teenager understands, but the world doesn't understand.
Characters like the Hulk struck a chord with a new generation of readers who were growing up questioning authority.
Here's this character that when he loses his cool, he becomes this green monster, and he goes on tirade.